Now, I love that you mentioned black pepper because I was thinking about that as you were talking. And this is a story that I've told over and over, but it's difficult for people. It's difficult for me to communicate clearly. Curcumin, turmeric. So turmeric is a root, right? Contains an active ingredient called curcumin, which is a polyphenolic compound. As you said, humans don't absorb much curcumin. If you eat turmeric root, which is a root, it's going to have some defense chemicals. You don't absorb much curcumin. It may actually affect the gut flora in a positive way. But if you add black pepper, which is a seed, which contains compounds like piperine and other toxic compounds called safrole, but specifically piperine inhibits an enzyme in the liver called UDP glucuronosyltransferase, right? Long name. It's part of our detoxification systems. And when you inhibit that enzyme with piperine and pepper, you now absorb 1,000 to 2,000 times more of the curcumin, which is not what your body wants at all. And yet people are doing liposomal curcumin. They're trying to just hack their way to absorbing large amounts of polyphenols that your body does not want. And it detoxifies them. They're toxins. Now, this idea that they could groom the human gut is fascinating, but don't mix it with black pepper. And again, there are other negative things with black pepper. So UDP glucuronosyltransferase is part of a detoxification system in the liver that is probably going to detoxify many polyphenols. And I think curcumin is not the only one that is going to be increased with black pepper. So this is why I'm not a fan of pepper. And I don't know if I probably should talk more about this on social media. I put salt on my food, but I never use pepper. And I will not eat food with pepper. If I go to a restaurant that has pepper, I'm scraping it off. I'm that guy. I know you guys all thought that I was that guy. You're right. I am that guy at the restaurant. This is why I can't eat barbecue in Austin, Texas, because it's covered in pepper and I scrape it off. Or, I went to barbecue with George St. Pierre when he was there. We were working with Heart and Soil. He collaborates with us at Heart and Soil. And I'm scraping the barbecue pepper off. Like, I do not eat pepper. And my gut doesn't feel as good if I even get a little bit in my food. I can taste it. So pepper is a seed. It's not healthy for humans. And that's why it's damaging to the gut in multiple ways. But yeah, resistant starch, not a good thing. You don't want to increase LPS in your body. Now, it's funny. I was texting one of our mutual friends about this. I'm bummed that there is no good clinical test for circulating lipopolysaccharide. If there were a way to test this, I think we would have a very powerful metric. There's an anti-LPS antibody that I talked about with Georgy Dinkov, but it's just a research metric. I can never get it because I wanted to track it. I wanted to track my anti-LPS antibody in the body. I would love to experiment with different foods, add potato to my diet, or add squash to my diet, or just do fruit and honey, or add mango and see, does it change this LPS? Like, how do I feel? That would be interesting to me, but there's no real way for people to measure endotoxin in the body. It's just clinical symptoms, right? Which is probably all we really need at this point.
Yeah. So the good news there is typically I think we can identify it pretty clearly if a simple test, have some fruit juice versus have the whole fruit, versus having the whole fruit with the fiber and see how you feel. Are you generally dealing with bloating and gas when you consume things that would be potentially fermented? Do you have brain fog? Does it decrease your energy? Those are pretty clear signs normally. And yeah, it would be great to have the lab test to corroborate that. But, I think for right now, that's what we have to go with.
Yeah. So that's a good intro to gut. The gut is a very deep rabbit hole that we'll have to go on down more in a separate episode if we can. But I think high level, we've talked about fruit juice, honey, maple syrup. These are going to be the easiest to digest. I think if people want to experiment with some roots, do so carefully, but it's possible. It's kind of the gray area for me too with an animal-based diet. Maybe white rice, though I think that can be more problematic for people. But beyond that, I think that the sources of carbohydrates are tricky. And I do think that if people want to include starches in their diet, remember that there are starches like squash or pumpkin, which are actually fruits. And, whenever I've experimented with starches, I always use a pressure cooker. I'm going to try and cook it as much as I possibly can. Just cook the crap out of it. Any other carbohydrate recommendations for people that are easily digestible?
Yeah. So really lean into whole fruit, dried fruit, fruit juices, frozen fruit, depending on what your availability of fresh fruit is. Those things can be really helpful. As far as root vegetables go, if someone is going to eat potatoes or sweet potatoes, which again, gray area depending on the individual, I would say at the very least, definitely remove the skins where most of the or high concentrations of the anti-nutrients are going to be held, and make sure they're very well cooked and consumed with a good amount of saturated fat. Anytime we're consuming any starch, that's really important. Again, talking about maybe one other aspect of the gut on the fat side is these saturated fats have really great antimicrobial effects. So consuming it alongside the starch will help to prevent bacteria from consuming them, and also will stimulate the production and release of bile, which is also our main antibiotic that's meant to keep the small intestine clear of bacteria. So I would definitely be doing that if we are consuming those forms of carbohydrates. And I would echo, the whole squash family, including pumpkin and zucchini and things like that, as good sources as well. And then honey, maple syrup, those